that environmental sciences one is really curious to me. I would actually very much like to see what's going on in there. Because I would wager there's something squirrely about it that's just kind of weird to me. Alrighty. I hope you all are doing well. I wanted to come back to Free the Inquiry on Substack, which, if you're not following it, you should be, because it's actually quite a good read. Um, and that's because Nate Tenhundfeld, again, not sure if I'm pronouncing his last name right, so apologies if I mispronounced it, but um, Nate is back, and he had another post last week on Free the Inquiry, which I thought was also a good one to get into. And why? Because it's a bit of bone of contention I've had for a while, is for all the DEI related stuff and statements and what have you, nobody's actually done a whole lot of friggin' research. And so it's actually really nice to see. Doesn't matter to me necessarily as much if it's in a peer-reviewed journal or not, because something simple like this doesn't necessarily have to be, but at the same time, it gives a good opportunity to see certain things and start getting answers to questions of interest. So from Free the Inquiry here, written by Nate Tenhundfeld, talking about his work here, because in the previous one he talked about regional trends in the usage of DEI statements, which, again, if you go where I am at with that, it's ideological litmus test, regardless of how it's used or who uses it at that point. So let us begin and recap this one a little bit. In a prior post for Free the Inquiry, I showed regional differences in requiring submission of DEI statements by applicants as part of the hiring process. The analysis showed a notable relationship between the politics of a state and whether job ads for full-time professorships in that state requested a DEI statement as part of their application process. Now, I remember saying this at the time. I have questions about other types of positions, and also pointed out, some of this ridiculously small sample size, because it was like 3 in North Dakota and 13 in Vermont, I think. Sorry, that's statistically, that doesn't make a great sample as far as I can tell. But anyway, as a follow-up, I wanted to see what emerges if we expand the data set to include all faculty positions, not just full-time professorships. Would including job ads for non-tenure track positions, lecturers, or adjunct professors change the picture? So that's actually getting in the direction of what I thought. But there's also a lot of staff-related positions like postdocs, as well as research scientists or research scholars or things like that, who are not technically themselves faculty, which, they also are around and involved in the university system and play important roles themselves. So just not as prominent as professorships, whether they be lecturers or adjuncts or full-time professors. But anyway, I gathered job ads from hireadjobs.com for relevant jobs in the U.S. posted during August 2024. In total, there were 5,005 from all 50 states and Washington, D.C., covering 966 institutions. Much better sample size, actually. Of those, 1,907 were for full-time professorship positions used in the original analysis, and 3,098 were for non-tenure track positions. Each job description was sent to GPT-4o Mini through OpenAI's API to code for whether a DEI statement was requested, either as a standalone document or part of a cover letter, teaching statement, etc. As reported previously, 24.5%, 467 of job ads for full-time professorships requested DEI statements. Interestingly, however, only 7.9% of the lecturer adjunct positions called for DEI statements to be submitted as either a standalone document or as part of another requirement, another required document, such as a cover letter or teaching statement, which is an interesting thing by itself, actually. That is an interesting thing by itself, that it doesn't show up half as much for adjuncts. But let us continue for a moment. Perhaps this isn't a complete picture. One could imagine that some academic disciplines are more reliant on lecturers and adjunct positions and are also independently less likely to request DEI statements as a whole. Considering this possibility, I coded for 32 distinct academic disciplines within the data. once again leveraging GPT-4o Mini. I selected the top 20 disciplines by frequency of total job postings because each of them had at least 50 job postings in the dataset. I wanted to avoid disciplines with a smaller number of postings, as these could be more easily skewed as a function of the institution posting it. This trimming of the data left me with 4,821 advertisements, 96.3% of the original. Of those, 1,841 were full-time professorships, and 2,980 were adjunct and lecturer positions. The 20 disciplines are shown in this table. So agriculture, arts, biological sciences, business and economics, chemistry and chemical sciences, communication and media studies, computer science and IT, education, engineering and technology, environmental sciences. Would be curious to know what falls under that, because there's a lot of different things I could think of that could fall under that. That'd be like hydrology, ecology. Hydrology and ecology being big ones. Meteorology, climatology, oceanography. Keep on going down the list. Geology. Do they all fall under that? Just out of my curiosity, because subdisciplines under there, they would actually be quite different. Because like climate is where I am usually, and it's quite vastly different from hydrology and geology and oceanography as a discipline. Let's put it that way. Health and medicine, humanities and liberal arts, languages and literature, law and public policy, mathematics and statistics, philosophy, physics, psychology and counseling, social sciences, and sports and recreation. I then looked at job postings across different academic fields to see how often they asked for statements about diversity, equity, inclusion. I compared professorship positions to adjunct lecturer positions. This comparison showed a clear difference between these job types. Professorship positions were more likely to ask for DEI statements than adjunct lecturer roles. P-value of 0. Yeah, that's pretty damn statistically significant. I'll give you that. The pattern was consistent across almost all academic fields we studied, as you can see from the graphic below. Okay, let's see. Let's interpret the graphic here. Percent of faculty job ads requiring DEI statements for full-time professorships, adjuncts, and lecturers broken down by academic discipline. Okay, so it's interesting with the environmental sciences being the top one for professorships, but I do believe this goes back to what I just said, because there's some very distinct differences between climate science and hydrology, ecology. You got meteorology in there, of course, climate science. You have geology, oceanography. A lot of those kinds of physical, those are all environmental sciences. A lot of them are also physical sciences. So it's interesting what kind of distinctions could be made there. Like depending sometimes on the college, I know some of them fall into natural sciences and some of them fall into physical sciences. But yeah, so that's interesting and curious. And I do have to wonder, so might have to look up something here on the side real quick. But the other name, I think, for environmental sciences is geosciences, and it does incorporate more so than just geology, if you will, or anything related to geology. Because I think of such professional societies as the American Geophysical Union, which then does include things like oceanography, meteorology, climate science, all the rest go down the list there. And I guess I'm struggling for a reason why this would be, and I would take a wager that percentage of professorships like that might actually have something to do with what the professional societies related to those particular disciplines are pushing. And I am also very, very perplexed and surprised that it's higher than education, because education seems to be more buried in this DEI stuff than anything else. From what I read of the papers, we'll put it that way, because I pour into some of these papers that include DEI related things, not the faculty job ads. And so it's interesting to me to see environmental sciences be so high, it's certainly not the bulk of the literature. There's not a whole lot of the published, academic research papers that incorporate any of these kinds of social justice themes, and thank God for that. But to see it in the professorships, and the adjuncts are not the highest in that one, but it is still there. It's still up there toward the top of the list that he's got here. I think it's number 3 from parsing through it. Yeah, 12 and a half. It's like 3rd place of the adjuncts. This is interesting because I question. I'm starting to think that this is coming from perhaps some of the influence of the professional societies with different schools, or perhaps where those most prominent environmental sciences programs are for different universities. So that's kind of what I'm curious about as I read this. It's actually the fact that environmental sciences is the top one there is actually very interesting to me. But I suspect, oh gosh, I think it was actually, if I recall correctly, the American Geophysical Union that has been very much one of the professional societies that's been pushing some of the DEI related stuff. And so that's why I wonder, honestly, I'm just wondering why the trend is there with the professional society related things. So it's a curious thing. I've seen it with some of the professional societies pushing some of this stuff, which I don't think they should do. Shouldn't be involved in that at all, but fine. So I wonder if that's playing a role. So that was actually more curious to me looking at this chart, is the arrangement of which disciplines have the largest percentages themselves. And it's quite an interesting surprise to me. So I would be curious if Nate ends up doing more with this, where he ends up with here's the question. Can you do this again, but do it by subdiscipline in environmental sciences? So Nate, if you end up watching, can you do it again, but by subdiscipline in environmental sciences? Because I would actually be extremely curious to see how that breaks down with the subdisciplines in environmental science. Because I know there's quite a lot in there that could be making that happen. That large number of 63-ish% could be making that happen, but I'm very curious, which discipline is it, really? Which disciplines is it? And so can we then look back at what might be going on with professional societies with respect to the discipline? What might be going on with respect to the universities? Is it a university with a more prominent environmental science program that's kind of driving it, or more prominent ones? Let's dive a little deeper is basically what I'm saying, because I'm speculating. I don't honestly know for sure. I just see an interesting trend. Perhaps the biggest criticism of DEI statements in hiring is that, in practice, they serve as little more than political litmus tests. I agree with that sentiment, to be honest. One would think that if DEI statements were being used for more than assessing the political beliefs of prospective coworkers, we would see parity between the rates at which different jobs request them. Does that make sense to think that, though? I don't know that it does. I don't know that it does, but anyway. But we see considerable divergence between the points. If the pursuit of DEI goals is utterly central to the proper function of the university, why should there be any difference in DEI statement requirements by the types of faculty positions? We would expect little or no difference, especially given that non-tenure track faculty at institutions more frequently interact with students than their tenure track or tenured colleagues. Is this an issue of inconsistently applied values, or reflective of the reality that non-tenure track positions are treated as relatively disposable and inconsequential? See, that is an observation here too, is that particularly with that widest one in environmental sciences, again, go back and dive more into that. I'd be very curious. But I'm inclined to think that it has to do with the fact that, adjuncts and lecturers, they're lecturing students and interacting with students, but they're not there in the long term to actually be able to shape the policy and function of the university. Whereas the tenured professors and the tenure track professors could be there 30. In fact, I know a professor at one university, consider him a good friend. He's been at that university for more than 50 years teaching. he's brilliant at what he does, but he's been there for freaking ever. Um, Love him. He's a brilliant professor. But he's still there teaching students. But he's the kind of one that might be, his kind of position might be targeted by having more DEI statements. Why? Because he's going to be there longer as a tenure track professor or tenured professor to influence the structure and direction of the university and the faculty body, and what then gets also taught to students to begin with, because a lot of lecturers can't necessarily, I don't think, deviate too much from the desired curriculum. I could be wrong about that. Not as familiar with adjuncts and lecturers as I am with full-time professorships myself, but I think that actually makes a lot of sense, that it's not necessarily the inconsistency of values, but it could actually just be that they're kind of not there all the time, and they're not necessarily going to be there in the long term to influence the policy of the university. Now, that said, there is another reason I can think of, is that DEI statements are relatively new. I've only seen them come into real serious prominence in the last 5 to 10 years. So I don't know that it's I guess my question is, has it even made it into enough prominence and regular use that you would start using it frequently for adjuncts and lecturers? Is it just a matter of it being something novel still, that it's just not being used as much, coupled with other things? Don't know. Again, I'm speculating, but this is really interesting to see. Also interesting to note is the consider variability between disciplines and how often DEI statements are requested, with the caveat that these data only still represent a small fraction of the jobs that will be posted over the coming year. The percentage of full-time professorship job ads requesting a DEI statement ranged from 0% in sports to 63.2% in environmental sciences. Again, I'm really wondering what's going on in that environmental sciences one, because I take a wager that it might be very specific disciplines that are actually driving that number high. So I might suggest you go back and do this again, but just break apart that environmental sciences one. Which one is it? What discipline is it? Or are they all the same and I'm completely wrong? But I have a suspicion that it's probably a specific discipline in there that might be doing this. And it might be particularly, well, I'm not going to speculate which discipline. I'm going to leave it at that. But I do think there's probably a specific discipline that might be driving that more than others. That's just me, though, when I was thinking about it. While the use of DEI statements in hiring remains controversial, the wide variation in requirements suggests wide variation in their underlying rationale. Former Siegel Center research fellow Azam Sharif has emphasized the importance of universities and colleges being crystal clear about the reasons for promoting DEI. The data that I've just discussed suggests that there is, in fact, little agreement about their importance, value, and appropriateness in hiring, in academic faculty hiring. Well, that's great, because they shouldn't be used at all, frankly. That's not relevant. I don't think, and I do find them as political litmus tests. I have yet to see it be useful for anything, but it's an interesting piece. I hope you all go read it. I've given my thoughts, and again, that environmental sciences one is really curious to me. I would actually very much like to see what's going on in there, because I would wager there's something squirrely about it that's just kind of weird to me. But anyway, let me know what you think. Hit the like button on the way out the door, comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that lovely good jazz. Till next time, I'm Adrian. Stay curious.